Hello, everyone. I want to do a brief overview video for the last part of the course, Part 5, The Dead. The kind of themes that we'll be looking into in the last part of the course are certainly ones that we have come across before in what we've been reading, especially once we started looking at, in Part 3, theories of immortality, reading Plato and Landsberg, and then certainly Hartshorne and Jonas. Whenever we sort of get out of the Epicurean space where we started, that is, the Epicurean space is the space that's created by Epicurus' theory of death, that death is the absolute limit of life. So, for instance, to ask an Epicurean, what is the ontological status of the dead, is a question that makes no sense, because the dead are nothing. The dead don't exist in any way, any conceivable way. The dead are nothing. Once we begin to look at alternatives to that Epicurean space, when we get into the sort of Plato and Landsberg space, you might see, let's call it the Platonic space, where death is seen as a kind of a transition. The question of what the ontological status of the dead is, that is, if the dead exist, in what form do they exist, becomes a real question. It becomes a sensible question. And I don't think it's one that Plato or Landsberg was concerned with describing, in the sense that they were focused on trying to prove the very idea of transition, you might say, the very idea of survival. They weren't concerned so much, except in the broadest terms, in describing what it's like to be dead, let's say. Certainly, Plato said that in death, the philosopher gets what they always wanted, which is knowledge. And certainly Landsberg said that death brings with it a self-realization of fulfillment. But neither of them really went beyond that, I think we could say. Hartshorne and Jonas both are more concerned with characterizing what it's like to be dead, basically. When I say the ontological status of the dead, ontology is just study of being. So ontological means having to do with being. And so the ontological status of the dead is, well, if they exist, in what manner do they exist? What way are the dead still something? Which is a question that Hartshorne, specifically asked. So these things have come up before, the dead. But it's only in the last part of the course that I think that we really focus on that, because at least for the first two readings, the overriding theme is grief and the human experience of grief, which is interesting, again, for us, I think, having started with Epicurus, who made the whole idea of an experience of death problematic. How can you say there's an experience of death? It may even be problematic, if you've been following, to say that we experience the deaths of others. Because if death is simply a terminus or an end or a limit, it has no duration in time. So strictly speaking, we can't even experience the deaths of others. You can experience a movie. You go to it, the images and sounds follow each other in time, and you have an experience of the movie. But a limit, if death is a limit, has no duration in time, so we can't directly experience it. If you sort of follow Landsberg's phenomenology, his description of the experience of the death of the other, it's the experience of their dying and their experience of their having died. There's no moment of death that you can say, I experienced it. But that being said, we may not be able to experience our own deaths at the end of the day. We may not be able even to experience the deaths of others in the most direct sense, but We can certainly say that we have the experience of grief, and grief is the experience of the loss of others. We grieve after someone has died, so that it's fully rational. It's completely logical to say that we have an experience of grief, because grief is not an experience of death directly. Grief is the experience of being left behind. Grief is the experience that we go through when someone has died. So that the first two readings have to do with that experience. What is that experience like? I think that these two readings, in terms of their style, in terms of the kind of writing they are, could not be more different, in that Donald Gustafson's essay, Grief, is an academic essay in which he's trying to define grief, trying to give a solid definition of what the emotion of grief actually is, in which he's very concerned with giving a very careful definition and then defending it against possible objections. So it's an academic essay. Whereas C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed is a very personal account of the death of his wife. A Grief Observed, if what we're being told is true, or is merely the journal that C.S. Lewis kept in the time just after his wife died. It was originally actually published under a pseudonym, because I thought it was thought perhaps by Lewis or his publishers to be too personal. And it wasn't, I think, until after Lewis himself died a few years later that it began to be published under his own name. It's very personal. And as we'll see, there may be reasons that Lewis might have wanted to publish it under a pseudonym, because it is, as one might expect, very emotional and very distraught. And although it is the work of a true thinker, it is also the work of somebody who's going through a mental trauma, who's going through a very severe suffering. But although these two works, Gustafson's Grief and Lewis's A Grief Observed, are incredibly different in terms of the kind of text they are, you will find, I think, some very interesting points of connection between them, which I won't go into now. But they're, I think, and the reason that I chose them is that Gustafson's theory of grief really does shed some light, gives us an interpretive framework for looking at Lewis's thoughts and his experiences as he goes through the actual experience of grief. Grief is about the dead. Grief is thinking about the dead. And part of grief is thinking about whether or not the dead still exist. Having made perhaps that choice that I think Landsberg almost forces upon us in section 4 of The Experience of Death, in which after the death of the loved one, we do have to make this existential choice about whether we think that their disappearance is, as he says, a sequel to annihilation, or whether their disappearance is merely relative to ourselves, is one of the most important choices we ever make in terms of being human beings and having people die on us. Making that choice for yourself about basically whether you think they still exist in some form, or whether you're an Epicurean and think that they do not. I think it's one of the most important choices we make. There are very few choices, I think, that philosophical choices that a human being is faced, is truly forced to make, and that's one of them. I think that human beings have to decide for themselves, for instance, whether God exists. And they have to be very honest with themselves. And I think that choice is one that I think everyone has to make. And another one is whether you really believe that the dead have some being, or whether their absence is a result of their annihilation, their becoming nothing. Grief necessitates that we think about those things, other things too. Walter Schultz's essay is not about grief. Um, it is really, it's about death, and it's about the status of the dead. It is a modern attempt, and by modern I mean 1970s, right? I mean it's 2020, man. I understand that, you know, I will call things contemporary or modern, which are 50 or 60 years old, but um, it's tough not to at my age. Um, but Schultz is also thinking about the status of the dead, what the dead are, if they are anything, and comes up with his own conclusion. That's the way I'm ending the course, but I'm not saying that it all comes down to Walter Schultz, but certainly Walter Schultz gives us, for some people, I think, a pretty articulate um, laying out of what a common modern view of death and the dead is. Not that you have to accept it, but I think that a lot of people do, actually. And in a certain way, it's a lot like Jonas and Hartshorn in the sense that it's something kind of second best or more moderate after the full-blown metaphysical immortality that is argued by Plato and Landsberg and similar thinkers. So the part 5 really is mostly about grief, but it's also about the dead. And as we'll see with C.S. Lewis's struggle with his own grief, the answers to these questions are not so simple. One might imagine that in answering the question, do you really believe the dead are still something, that your grief would be alleviated or made less painful if you believed that the dead were still something. And one of the most amazing things I think about Lewis's account of his own grief is that as a Christian, for most of the book at least, remember this is a book, somebody who's really going up and down in the throes of grief, but for most of the book, he certainly does believe that his wife is still something because he's a believing Orthodox Christian. But it doesn't really seem to help very much. That's what's really kind of very surprising about his grief, is that his Christianity is not in any obvious way helping him, at least in the immediate aftermath of his wife's death. So yeah, we're ending up, I think, in an appropriate place, talking about grief, the experience of grief, the deaths of others, and generally speaking, asking ourselves, well, if the dead do still exist in any form, what form do they exist in? And if they don't exist in any form, then how does that shape our whole view of death?